What's up, students? Happy New Year. Welcome to your first home group of 2023. We're so pumped to continue building on what God has been doing since September of last year, and we're excited to see what is in store for all of us this semester. But hey, real quick, before we get started, I want y'all to do something in your groups. I want you to pause this video and in your group, talk about what you're hoping to get out of home group over the next several months. Are you hoping to grow in your faith? Maybe you're hoping to dive deeper into community. So go ahead, pause this video, and talk about what you are hoping to get out of your home group this semester. All right, I'm sure some of you had similar answers, and man, I'm pumped just to see where we are all at by the end of the school year. But you know what? We're going to go ahead and jump right on into things. So last week, Rachel kicked off a brand new series called Simplify, right? The idea behind this series is that sometimes we can make faith in following Jesus more complicated than it really needs to be. And we're going to continue that conversation today. You know, one of the more popular verses in the Bible is Matthew 22:39, where Jesus tells it that we should love our neighbor as ourself. And you know, it's easy to do that when it comes to like our friends, the people who are like us, the people that we're in sports with, and all of those kind of things, right? We could do that kind of stuff all day without any problem. But Jesus even tells us that we're supposed to love our enemies. Now that's where it sounds like things get a little complicated. That's much easier said than done, right? However, this is something that Jesus is calling you and I to do as his followers. And so how do we do that? Well, the first thing we have to do is change our mindset. Typically, when we think of our enemies, we have this kind of us versus them mentality, and we need to start by changing that. The way that we change that is by seeing people the way that God sees people. Starting there can completely change the way that we go about our interactions with people and how we can care for one another. You know, there's a story in Matthew 9 that gives us actually a really good picture of how Jesus sees people, and you and I can learn from his example and strive to model Jesus's life in this way. And so the story's in Matthew 9, verses 9 through 13, and it says this. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many other tax collectors and disreputable sinners. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with such scum?" When Jesus heard this, he said, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do." Then he added, "Now go and learn from the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For I have come to call those not who think that they are righteous, but for those who know they are sinners." There's a couple interesting things we should catch in this passage that we should dive deeper into. First, we see Jesus is calling this guy Matthew to follow him and be one of his disciples. We're also told that he's a tax collector. Now, why do you think that detail about Matthew is included? Why is the fact that Matthew is a tax collector included in this story? Well, when we do a deeper dive into tax collectors at this time, they were absolutely hated by everyone else. At this time, the Roman Empire was ruling over the Israelites, right? Not good if you're an Israelite, but here's the reputation tax collectors had amongst other Israelites. They were seen as traitors and thieves. They were seen as traitors because they were typically Israelite people who worked for the Romans, their oppressors. That's not a good reputation to have with your friends, that you're someone who works for the enemy. But being a tax collector, people would come to Matthew and he would tell them how much they owed the Roman government. And here's where things get bad. They would lie about how much money people owed so that they could take the excess money and pocket it for themselves. It's not good, right? All this to say, tax collectors were not seen as good people and they had a bad reputation. And I'm sure people looked down on them. They probably didn't have many friends. They probably were treated bad, or maybe people would treat them like they didn't even exist. But in this passage, we see Jesus doesn't do any of those things. He actually does the opposite. Jesus calls Matthew to be one of his disciples. He has this encounter with Matthew that many people probably didn't expect would happen, but it doesn't stop there. When we keep reading in Matthew 9, we see that at a later point in time, Jesus is eating dinner with even more tax collectors and disreputable sinners. He's hanging out with them. He's sharing a meal with them. He's hanging out at Matthew's house with them. These people that society didn't care about and was leaving behind, Jesus is intentional in being with them in his interactions with them. And the Pharisees, as we saw, they really do not like that Jesus is doing this. They asked his disciples how he could be seen around these people. See, there's kind of that us versus them mentality we were talking about earlier. The Pharisees are guilty of doing that. And they're supposed to be some of the most religious people and the ones who would teach and uphold God's law. And they're basically disgusted by what Jesus is doing. Jesus, man, he needs to correct them in this analogy of how a doctor treats sick people, not people that are well. And how he has come not for the people who think they are righteous, but plot twist, because nobody is righteous on their own. Jesus actually comes for those who know they are sinners, which is all of us. But there's a couple things to highlight from this passage that help us see just how God sees other people. First, we see that God doesn't show favoritism, but he cares for everyone equally. When Jesus was on earth, he didn't only hang out with the same people every single moment of every single day, but he hung out with sinners, with tax collectors, with prostitutes. Jesus didn't just interact with people who fit a certain mold or even those who were actively following him yet, but he cared for everyone the same. His heart is for all people, not just a specific few. This shows us that Jesus doesn't show favoritism, and neither should we. Secondly, Jesus was intentional with all people. We know that Jesus was intentional with disciples who he poured into, who he partnered with, who are his friends. But in this passage, we see that Jesus was intentional even with those society was kicking to the curb. You know, in biblical times, it was a very intentional and personal thing to share a meal with somebody. And in this story, we see Jesus being very intentional and personal with people that most other people probably wouldn't share a meal with. So we see that Jesus cared for everyone. He was intentional with all people, and he was personal with all people. That's how Jesus saw people, and what this means for that you and me is that we should see people the way that Jesus sees people. We should strive to follow Jesus' example and treat people the same way that he did. And this is easy to do with our friends and the people that we naturally click with. As we were talking about earlier, where this gets hard and where I want to challenge you with is to treat people who are different than you this way. People who aren't following Jesus. The people that you might even actively go out of your way to avoid interacting with. Treat those people the way that Jesus treated the tax collectors, the sinners, and the prostitutes. Because Jesus didn't avoid them, he cared about them and was intentional in his interactions with them. And you guys, we should do the same. Now, I'm not saying that you need to change who you spend all your time with, but maybe there's someone that God is already kind of putting on your heart right now that fits what we've been talking about. Maybe this means that you invite them to lunch with you and your friends. You make the effort to have a real conversation with them in class and actually show interest in what they have to say. Sometimes we make this more complicated than it needs to be, but to simplify, Jesus wants us to see people and interact with them the way that he did. And when we do that, we can share Jesus with them by treating them the way that Jesus would treat him if he was physically still here on earth, alive and walking. And you guys, that could change someone's life. Well, we're getting ready to break for some group discussion, but before we do that, here are a couple things going on in Pizza Sim that you need to know about.
Hey there, thanks for watching. Before you go to group, we have a few things we want to make sure you know about. With it being January and officially 2023, High Def is almost here. As a reminder, registration for High Def closes on January 17th. So if you haven't signed up yet, do it now. Speaking of High Def, the theme this year is Upside Down Kingdom. We're going to be talking all about how Jesus lived a life that was totally different than the culture around him and how we're called to do the same. Our speaker, Ashley Bohens, is going to be talking all about it. You aren't going to want to miss out. Also, if you're not aware, or to just refresh your memory, High Def is our student conference that is filled to the brim with awesome speaking, worship, and a ton of fun competition. Speaking of competition, PTSM is finally ready to reveal the tribes for High Def 2023. Are you ready? Reminder, your tribe assignments will not be revealed until right before High Def. This is just so you can look forward to what's to come. Okay? So our tribes are Royals, Swarm, Siren, and Frenzy. Make sure you and your friends are signed up for High Def to get in on all the awesome stuff I just talked about. Finally, we've got a lot of fun stuff planned this semester that you're not going to want to miss out on. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at @thebtsm to hear about whenever we do new things. Until then, see you later!